Under the burning orange skies of the frontier, where dust curled like smoke and the air carried the smell of gunpowder and sage, two worlds stood staring at each other. The Apache camp spread across the Red Valley like a shadow of the old earth, silent but alive, its fires flickering beneath the mountains. Across the plains, the white settlement shimmered in the heat, marked by the tall frame of a church steeple and the badge of the law hanging on the chest of the man who ruled Iata the sheriff. Between these two worlds rode fate itself, wearing the faces of a young Apache warrior and the daughter of that sheriff. He was the son of the Apache chief, born beneath the cry of an eagle, raised to be the next leader of his people. His heart was wild like the wind that swept through the canyon, and his eyes carried the untamed fire of the desert sun. She, on the other hand, was the lawman's daughter, raised behind fences and hymns, her spirit caught between duty and curiosity. From her porch she would often watch the sunset sink into the land of the Apaches, wondering what lay beyond those red hills. Her father told her it was danger. Her heart whispered it might be something else. The war between their worlds had lasted for years. The settlers feared the Apaches, and the Apaches despised the settlers for the land stolen from them.
Oh.
Blood had soaked into the sand more times than anyone could count. Yet that evening, when the wind carried the smoke from the burnt wagons, destiny drew a different line across the desert. The young Apache stood on the ridge, watching the white settlement below. His people had captured supplies from a caravan that afternoon, and though victory usually burned bright in him, this time his heart was restless. He had seen her there, riding beside her father, sunlight caught in her hair, and in that brief glance, something changed, something he couldn't explain. She had seen him too. The moment their eyes met across that endless plain, time seemed to stop. He was everything she had been warned about, fierce, dangerous, untamed. Yet there was something in his gaze that didn't fit the stories she had been told. It wasn't hatred, it was longing, and that feeling haunted her long after she turned away. That night, while her father's men spoke of vengeance, she stood by the window, staring toward the dark horizon, wondering if he was still out there watching the same stars. The following days brought more tension. A truce meeting was arranged between the sheriff and the Apache chief. Both sides came armed, both suspicious. The young Apache stood beside his father, tall and silent. The sheriff's daughter had followed secretly, hiding behind the wagons, curious to see the people her father called enemies. When her eyes found him again among the warriors, her breath caught. He noticed her too, though he said nothing. The wind carried only silence, heavy with unspoken truths. The talks fell apart before sunset, leaving both sides angrier than before. But that night, under the full moon, she slipped away from town, drawn by something she couldn't resist. By the river, where the moonlight touched the water like silver, she saw him again. He stepped from the shadows, his spear lowered, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of the river filled the silence. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." He smiled faintly and replied, "Nor should you." Her heart pounded. Every instinct told her to run, yet she couldn't move. He stepped closer, the glow of the moon revealing the scar across his shoulder proof, of battles fought and survived. She reached out, almost without thinking, and her fingers brushed the edge of that scar. In that moment, the walls between them cracked. It was not the touch of strangers, but of two souls recognizing something ancient and forbidden. When the wind rose, it carried the sound of hoofbeats. The sheriff's men were searching for her. Panic flashed in her eyes. Without hesitation, the Apache took her hand and pulled her into the cover of the rocks. They hid in silence as torches moved across the plain. She could feel his heart beat against her arm, fast, but steady. When the danger passed, she looked up at him and whispered, "If they find you here, they'll kill you." His answer was quiet but firm. "Then I'll die knowing what freedom feels like." She didn't know what to say, only that his words stayed in her heart long after she returned home. Days turned to weeks, and their secret meetings continued. By the cliffs, by the river, in the whisper of the desert wind, they found each other again and again. The Apache chief's son spoke to her of his people, of the spirits of the land and the pride of the warriors who lived by honor. She spoke of her world, of laws and order, and the pain that came with pretending not to feel. The more they talked, the more they realized how much they shared and how much the world wanted to keep them apart. Love grew quietly between them, hidden beneath the noise of hate. But the frontier was not kind to such things. One night, a patrol spotted her horse near the river. Rumors spread through town. The sheriff grew suspicious. He found a feather tied to his daughter's saddle. His blood ran cold. The next morning, he called for war. The Apache chief, hearing of the betrayal, swore vengeance of his own. The lovers met one last time before the storm began. The sun was setting behind the mountains, the sky painted in fire. He held her hand, his voice trembling but strong. "If they make me choose between you and my people," he said, "I will fight the world before I fight you." Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "And I will stand against my own blood if it means saving yours." The wind carried their words into the distance. They both knew that fate would not show mercy. The next dawn would bring war. She begged him to flee, to run far from the valley before the guns thundered. But he shook his head. "The chief's son cannot run," he said quietly, "but a man can fight for love." She kissed his hand, knowing it might be the last time. The air trembled between them, filled with everything they couldn't say. As the night fell, the first fires appeared on the horizon. The settlers gathered their rifles, the Apaches sharpened their blades, and the land held its breath. She stood at her window, clutching the small carved pendant he had given her, praying the wind would carry her love across the battlefield. Far beyond the ridge, he mounted his horse, his eyes fixed toward the town, the same pendant hanging from his neck. The stars above looked down, knowing that by sunrise, one world would bleed into another. And when the first shot cracked through the silence, the story of the Apache chief's son and the sheriff's daughter truly began, born not from peace, but from the fire of two hearts that refused to bow to fate. The morning after that single gunshot, the valley looked as if the earth itself had been scorched by fate. Smoke hung heavy in the air, drifting between the canyon walls like gray ghosts. The bodies of men and horses lay scattered along the dry riverbed, and buzzards circled high above, waiting for silence to settle. But beneath that smoke, two hearts still beat, one behind the wooden walls of the sheriff's house, and the other among the wounded Apache warriors hidden deep in the canyon. The war between their people had begun, and neither could undo it. The sheriff's daughter sat by the window, her hands trembling as she watched her father's men return from battle. Their faces were hard and silent, their clothes stained with dust and blood. She searched for a sign that it was over, but every face told her it was only beginning. Her father's eyes were colder than she had ever seen. He gave orders without a word of mercy, vowing to hunt every Apache left in the valley. She wanted to speak, to beg him to stop, but she knew he would never understand. To him, the Apaches were killers. To her, one of them was the only man who had ever made her feel alive. Out in the canyons, the son of the Apache chief lay wounded, his arm wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. His father's camp had moved deeper into the mountains after the first fight. The elders called for vengeance, but he kept silent. He had led no attack, fired no shot, yet his people's blood had been spilled because of a love he could never confess. Each night he lay awake, listening to the cries of the wounded and the wind that carried the scent of smoke from the white town. In his heart, he still saw her face, pale and frightened, framed by the glow of lantern light. He didn't know if she was safe. He didn't know if she still believed in him. The days that followed were filled with whispers of fear and revenge. The settlers locked their doors and loaded their rifles. The Apaches hid their families among the rocks and prepared for another strike. Between those two worlds stretched a no-man's land, scorched and dangerous. Yet in that wasteland, two riders still found their way to each other. It was near sunset when she rode out again, wrapped in a cloak and carrying only a small pouch of medicine. Her heart raced with every hoofbeat, fearing she might be followed. She knew where to find him. The path wound through the dry creek, past the burned wagons and the bones of horses that hadn't survived. When she reached the canyon mouth, she saw him waiting there, leaning weakly against a rock. His arm was bound, his body worn, but his eyes still carried that same fire that had once frightened and comforted her all at once. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. She dismounted and knelt beside him, her voice trembling. He said the same the first time. She poured water from her canteen and pressed it to his lips. He drank, never taking his eyes off her. "If they find you here," he murmured, "they'll call you a traitor." She looked away, her voice low. "Maybe I already am." For a moment neither spoke. Silence between them was heavier than words. He finally broke it. "My father thinks the spirits curse us for meeting. Says the white man's world poisons everything it touches." She met his gaze and whispered, "And what do you believe?" His answer came slow and uncertain. "I believe the spirits gave me a heart, and it doesn't know how to stop loving you." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same, that her world was falling apart without him, but the sound of distant gunfire cut through the air. Both turned toward the echo that rolled across the hills. The war was still alive. He rose to his feet, wincing from the pain in his arm. "Go back," he said. "They'll come looking for you soon." She hesitated. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "I'll fight if I must. But not for blood, for something worth saving." When she rode back to Wardtown, the sky had turned crimson, and the wind carried the sound of drums from the mountains. The Apaches were gathering again. She knew what that meant. The settlement would strike first. She found her father on the porch sharpening his knife, his face drawn and tired. "We'll end this," he muttered. "By dawn, I'll see every one of them gone." She tried to plead to reason, but he wouldn't listen. His hatred was born from years of loss, his brother killed in a raid, his friends buried under the same soil he now defended. He couldn't see that the war had changed, that there was something human hidden within it. That night, she sat alone in her room, clutching the Apache pendant around her neck. Each heartbeat felt like a drum calling her back to him. She wondered what kind of world they could ever have. Could love survive between two people whose names were cursed by their own blood? She remembered his words by the river that a man could fight for love, and she whispered them to herself like a prayer. Far in the canyon, the Apache camp prepared for battle. Warriors painted their faces in red and black. The chief stood tall before the fire, his voice echoing through the night. "The white men broke their promise. They took our land and spilled our blood. Tomorrow, we take it back." The son stood in silence at the edge of the firelight, torn between duty and desire. He wanted to speak, to tell his father that war would only bring more graves, but he knew his words would mean nothing now. When the chance rose, he walked away into the shadows. He climbed to the ridge where the valley opened wide under the stars. The wind was cold against his skin, carrying the smell of rain. He closed his eyes and remembered her touch, her voice, the warmth of her hand against his chest. Every memory was a wound and a comfort at once. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the flicker of lanterns far below the town, quiet for now, unaware of the storm that would soon fall upon it. As midnight came, the rain began to fall. The first drop struck the dust like tears. He sat by the rocks, watching the horizon glow faintly with lightning. Somewhere beyond that ridge, she was awake too, staring into the same storm. Their worlds might burn before the night ended, but the thought that she still cared kept him breathing. At dawn, the thunder of hooves shook the valley. The sheriff's men rode out with rifles raised. The Apaches were waiting in the mist. The land echoed with the cry of battle once more. But this time, it was different. The chief's son wasn't among the warriors. He had ridden out alone before the first light, carrying nothing but his bow and the hope that he could stop what was coming. When he reached the border between the two camps, he saw her running toward him. Rain soaking through her dress, fear in her eyes. She had left before her father could see her go. They met in the open plain where the wet earth smelled of gunpowder and thunder rolled above them. "You have to stop them," she begged. "If this keeps going, there'll be nothing left." He nodded, his voice breaking. "I'll try." But they don't listen to hearts anymore. Behind them, the sound of war grew louder, shouts, gunfire, and the cry of the dying. The rain fell harder, washing the blood into the soil. He turned toward the hills where his father's warriors were charging, and then looked back at her. "If I don't come back," he said, "remember that I tried to make peace." She reached for him, her voice trembling. "Don't talk like that." But he was already turning away, mounting his horse. She watched him ride into the storm, the wind tearing through his hair, the sky burning with lightning. Every hoofbeat carried him farther from her and closer to the chaos that awaited. She fell to her knees in the mud, her heart breaking with each shot that echoed across the valley. In the distance, the chief's son galloped through the smoke, shouting for his men to stop, his voice lost in the roar of battle. Arrows flew past him, bullets hissed through the rain. Not once his weapon, not once. His only goal was to reach his father, to make him see reason before the land turned red again. But the storm had already claimed the day, and destiny was closing in around them both. The battle raged on, but somewhere in that chaos, faint hope still flickered to souls bound by love, caught between the old ways and the new, between vengeance and forgiveness. The valley held its breath, waiting to see which would survive. Rain had turned the valley into mud by morning, but the guns never stopped. Smoke rose from the lower ridge, black against the pale sky. The air reeked of wet earth and gunpowder, and the cries of the wounded drifted like ghosts across the plains. The son of the Apache chief rode through that storm of noise, his horse bleeding from a shallow cut, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to lose. He shouted to his warriors to hold their fire, to listen, but the chaos swallowed his voice. Each shot felt like a hammer striking at his soul. He had come to stop the war, but all around him men fought as if peace had never been a word. Back in the settlement, the sheriff's daughter stood on the porch with her father's rifle clutched tight in her hands. The rain plastered her hair to her face as she watched men reload and fire from behind the fence. She could see the flashes from the ridge, and though her father warned her to stay back, her eyes searched for one figure among the storm. She knew he was out there, fighting the battle neither of them wanted. Fear and guilt twisted inside her. Every bullet fired by her people felt like it tore through her heart. Inside the house, her father barked orders. His voice was hoarse, his coat soaked, his temper burning hotter than the lantern flames. He had lost 2 deputies already, and his men were running low on ammunition. Yet when he looked at his daughter, he saw something else: defiance, sorrow, and something he couldn't name. "You stay inside," he snapped. "This ain't your fight." She met his eyes and whispered, "It is if it kills the one I love." He froze for a moment, the words striking him harder than any bullet. Before he could reply, another explosion shook the air outside. The Apache warriors had driven the settlers back toward the edge of town, but their chief's son wasn't among them. He had ridden straight into the no-man's land, waving a white cloth tied to his spear, shouting in both tongues for the fighting to stop. A bullet grazed his leg, but he didn't fall. When at last his voice broke through the thunder, a few men hesitated. The sheriff's daughter saw him then alone, unarmed, his dark hair plastered with rain, his face fierce and desperate. She dropped the rifle and ran toward him before her father could stop her. The world seemed to slow as she crossed the open ground, mud splashing under her boots, bullets whining past. The Apache warriors recognized her and held their fire. The settlers did not. One shot struck the ground beside her, another tore through her sleeve. She kept running. When she reached him, she threw her arms around him, her voice shaking. "Stop it, please. I'll kill us both." He held her close, his heart pounding against hers. "Then let them see what they're killing," he said. On the ridge, the Apache chief watched in disbelief as his son stood in the open, the sheriff's daughter clinging to him. Rage burned in the old man's eyes. He raised his hand to signal his warriors, but one of the elders grabbed his arm. "Ow." "Look," the elder whispered. "The boy carries no weapon. The spirits might be speaking." The chief hesitated. Below, the settlers were shouting, the sheriff's men dragging her father toward the barricade. When the sheriff saw his daughter standing with the enemy's son, his face turned white. "Get away from him," he roared, leveling his rifle. The girl stepped in front of the Apache warrior, tears streaming down her face. "No, father. If you shoot him, you'll have to shoot me too." The rain fell harder, drumming on the barrels of the guns, drowning out everything except the sound of breathing and thunder. The Apache warrior looked up at the sheriff and called out in English, his voice steady. "I came to stop this. Not for land, not for blood, for peace." No one moved for a long moment. Then a shot cracked from somewhere behind the lines, not from the sheriff's rifle, but from one of the frightened men. The bullet struck the Apache warrior's shoulder. He staggered, but didn't fall. The sheriff's daughter screamed and caught him as he collapsed to his knees. The world exploded again into chaos. The Apaches roared in fury, charging down the hill. The settlers fired wildly, the truce shattered. She dragged him behind a wagon, her hands shaking as she pressed her scarf to the wound. "You'll be fine," she whispered, though her voice broke. He smiled weakly. "The earth takes what it wants," he said, "but not today." She tore strips of cloth, wrapped his shoulder tight, and looked toward the ridge where the fighting raged. The Apache chief saw his son fall and thought he was dead. With a cry that shook the valley, he ordered his warriors forward. By midday, the battle had turned into chaos on both sides. Fires spread through the settlement. The wind carried ash across the plain. The sheriff's daughter managed to pull the wounded warrior into the shelter of an old barn at the edge of town. She found a lantern, a few blankets, and a small bottle of whiskey used for pain. He was pale and cold, his breath shallow. She poured the liquor over the wound, whispering prayers she barely remembered. Outside, the sound of hooves approached. She froze, pressing a hand over his mouth. "Hey!" Through the cracks in the barn wall, she saw her father ride past with 3 men, searching the outskirts. His face was hard, his eyes red. She knew he wouldn't rest until every Apache was gone or dead. When the riders passed, she let out a trembling breath. He looked at her, his voice faint. "Why are you still here?" She met his gaze, her eyes full of tears. "'Cause leaving you would mean killing what's left of me." As night fell, the rain finally stopped. The barn was quiet, except for the sound of his breathing. She dozed beside him, her head resting on his chest. When she woke, the moonlight spilled through the cracks in the roof, painting the dirt floor silver. He was gone. Panic gripped her. She stumbled outside, calling his name in the dark. Then she saw him by the river, leaning against a fallen log, watching the stars. "You shouldn't move," she said softly. He turned, his face pale but calm. "I had to see the sky. I don't know if I'll see it again." She walked to him, knelt beside him, and whispered, "Don't say that." In the distance, gunfire still echoed, though weaker now. The fighting had moved farther away. Somewhere in the darkness, the Apache chief searched for his son, unaware he was only a mile from him. The sheriff sat alone in his house, staring at his daughter's empty room, realizing for the first time that love could be an enemy stronger than any war. By dawn, the fires were dying. The valley was covered in smoke. The Apache warriors had retreated to the mountains, carrying their wounded. The settlers buried their dead, but neither side could claim victory. The land had swallowed too much blood to give anything back. The sheriff's daughter stayed hidden in the barn until morning, tending to the Apache's wound. He tried to stand, but his strength was gone. She helped him to the doorway, where they watched the sunrise together. "What happens now?" she asked. "Look toward the mountains. My people will come for me. Your father will come for you. And when they find us, the world will decide if love is stronger than hate." She took his hand and held it tight. "Then let them find us together." The sound of approaching horses echoed from both directions, one from the town, one from the hills. The air was heavy with dread, yet neither moved. The Apache warrior looked at her, his eyes calm and full of sorrow. "If this is the end," he said softly, "then let it be our beginning." She leaned her head against his shoulder as the riders came into view, their banners rising through the mist. 2 worlds, 2 fates, and 1 impossible love stood between them, caught in a silence deeper than the storm that had started it all. The valley held its breath once more, waiting for the next heartbeat that would decide everything. The sound of horses closing in from both directions carried through the damp air, echoing off the cliffs like the pulse of an approaching storm. The sheriff's daughter clung tighter to the Apache warrior's arm, her breath trembling in the cold. In that moment, the world seemed split between 2 dawns, the pale light behind the mountains where the Apaches rode, and the rising sun over the plains where her father's men approached. The valley, once silent, was now the meeting ground of everything they had tried to escape. He could see the glint of rifles in the distance, the riders moving fast through the haze. "They're both coming," he murmured. She nodded, her eyes locked on the horizon. "Then we have no more time to hide." He turned to her, his voice low but steady. "If they see us together, neither side will listen." She shook her head. "Then let them see. Let them know this war is not what they think." Her words carried a desperate courage that made him pause. He had fought many battles, but none like this, where love itself felt like rebellion against the earth. The first to arrive were the sheriff's men. They rode hard, their coats soaked with dew, their eyes sharp with suspicion. The sheriff led them, his jaw tight, his hand resting on his revolver. When he saw his daughter standing beside the wounded Apache, something inside him broke. "Step away from him," he called, his voice echoing through the valley. Now she didn't move. "He's not your enemy," she shouted. "He came to stop the fighting." The sheriff's expression hardened. "All my life, I've buried friends who said the same thing." Before he could raise his gun, the distant cry of war horns cut through the silence. From the hills, the Apache warriors appeared, spreading across the ridge like shadows in the rising sun. They came in silence at first, then with shouts that rolled through the air like thunder. The chief rode in front, his face streaked with war paint, his eyes fixed on the sight below, his son standing beside the daughter of the man who had brought death to his people. His heart clenched in rage and confusion. For a few breathless seconds, no one moved. The wind whipped between the two sides, carrying the smell of wet grass and smoke. The sheriff's daughter looked from one group to the other, realizing that a single wrong word could turn this valley into a graveyard. She took a step forward, her voice breaking as she shouted, "No more blood." But her cry was drowned out by the sound of rifles being cocked, of arrows being notched. The line between peace and war was so thin it could break with a whisper. The Apache warrior stood tall despite his wound. He raised his hands, showing he carried no weapon. "Father," called out in his native tongue. The old chief's gaze burned into him. "You shame your people," the chief thundered. "You stand beside the daughter of the enemy." The warrior's voice trembled with pain but not fear. "I stand beside the only truth left in this land. There is no enemy, only hearts that have forgotten how to listen." The sheriff lowered his gun slightly, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He looked at his daughter, her face pale but resolute, her hands trembling yet steady. The chief, seeing the pain in his son's eyes, hesitated for the first time. The two leaders, one carved by law, the other by tradition, stood facing each other across the muddy field, both trapped by the ghosts of their past. But not all men knew how to wait. One of the sheriff's deputies, a younger man driven by anger and fear, raised his rifle and fired. The shot tore through the air and struck one of the Apache riders behind the chief. The warrior's horse reared, throwing him into the mud. The spell was broken. The valley erupted. Arrows flew like rain, bullets cracked against rocks, and the thunder of hooves filled the air. The sheriff's daughter screamed as the Apache warrior pushed her behind a fallen tree. "Stay down," he shouted, drawing a knife from his belt. The world turned into fire and chaos. The chief charged forward, his warriors following, their cries echoing across the plains. The sheriff shouted for his men to hold the line, his voice lost in the storm of war. The Apache warrior fought only to protect her, deflected a blow, disarmed one man, and dragged her toward the cover of the rocks. Each step felt like running through a nightmare. Smoke filled their lungs, and the ground shook beneath the clash of men who didn't even know why they still fought. He wanted to reach his father, to make him see reason. But the old man was lost in fury, his heart burning with the pain of losing too much for too long. Behind them, the barn where they had taken shelter was struck by fire. Flames spread fast, lighting the dark sky with a cruel glow. She turned to look, her voice breaking. "That's our only cover." He pulled her forward. "Then we keep moving." The two stumbled down toward the riverbank, where the reeds grew tall and the sound of the water drowned the screams above. For a moment, they found shelter among the rocks. The Apache warrior pressed his back to the cold stone, blood seeping from his shoulder. She tore a strip from her dress to stop the bleeding, her hands shaking. "You're losing too much," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "It's not the first time I've bled for what I believe." The gunfire slowly faded, replaced by the crackling of fire and the cries of the wounded. The battle had scattered both sides, but neither had won. The land itself seemed tired of the noise. Through the smoke, the warrior's eyes caught a shape moving down the Hiltha Apache chief. Dismounted, searching among the fallen. When his gaze found his son near the river, he stopped. For a long time, he said nothing. The sheriff appeared moments later, his coat torn, his face streaked with ash. When he saw his daughter kneeling beside the Apache, something in his anger softened. She stood, trembling but firm. "You can kill him," she said quietly, "but you'll have to kill me too." The sheriff looked at her as if seeing her for the first time not as a child, but as someone whose heart had crossed every line he ever drew. The Apache chief stepped closer, his hand on his spear, his eyes full of both fury and sorrow. "He is my son," he said, "but he has broken the ways of our people." The sheriff's reply came slow, heavy with exhaustion. "And she is my daughter, and she's broken mine." For the first time, the two men stood side by side, their pain mirrored in silence. The sky was turning red again, the sun rising over a field of smoke and blood. The warrior struggled to his feet, swaying but unbroken. "Maybe the earth needs something new," he said. "Not your ways or mine, but something that begins with forgiveness." The chief looked at him long, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his gaze toward the sheriff. "If I spare your town, will you spare my people?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I've buried too many to make promises." "Then bury one more," the chief said, his voice quiet. "The hate that feeds this land." Neither answered. The wind blew across the valley, lifting the ashes of what had been lost. Behind them, the surviving warriors and settlers stood still, watching the two leaders face each other in silence. The daughter's heart pounded as she looked from her father to the chief, knowing that one word could decide the fate of everyone left alive. Then a shot rang out, not from either side but from a distant ridge. A lone settler, wounded and enraged, had aimed at the Apache chief. The bullet struck the ground near his feet, but it was enough. The warriors lifted their bows again, the settlers raised their rifles. The fragile peace shattered like glass. The sheriff's daughter screamed, running toward the line between them, arms raised. "Stop!" she cried. But no one listened. The Apache warrior lunged forward, pulling her down just as another volley erupted. The sound was deafening, the air filled with dust and fire. When the smoke cleared, she was lying in his arms again, trembling, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Above them, the two sides prepared for one final charge, the moment before the storm when everything stood still. The Apache chief and the sheriff locked eyes one last time, both knowing what was coming, both powerless to stop it. The warrior held the woman he loved, whispering against her hair, "If this is our last breath, let them remember we tried." The world held its breath, the wind pausing, the earth trembling beneath the weight of what was about to happen. It in silence, the kind that only comes before the breaking of everything. The wind held still for a heartbeat. And then the world moved again. The Apaches and settlers faced one another through the smoke and dust, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. Every man on both sides waited for someone else to fire first. But the ones in the middle, the wounded Apache warrior and the sheriff's daughter, stood unarmed, soaked in rain and ash, clinging to each other like the last fragile piece of peace left in the valley. She could feel his heart beat against her arm, uneven but strong. His blood stained her dress, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of the earth after rain. Around them, men shouted orders, but their voices faded into something distant and meaningless. The Apache chief raised his hand to signal his warriors, but then his gaze met his son's, and he froze. He saw not betrayal in the boy's eyes, but something pure love, the kind that could never be taught, only felt. The sheriff saw the same in his daughter, and for the first time, he didn't see a rebel or a disappointment. He saw a woman standing for something she believed in. A single gunshot would have destroyed everything, but it never came. Instead, silence spread through the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of fire dying out. The sheriff lowered his weapon first. The gesture was small, but it changed the air. The Apache chief hesitated, then slowly lowered his spear. One by one, the men followed. No words were spoken, yet everyone knew the war had met its limit. The land itself seemed to sigh, tired of taking sides. The sheriff's daughter helped the wounded warrior to his feet. His body trembled, but his grip on her hand was firm. They stood between two armies, the valley wide and still, as dawn painted the hills in pale gold. The old chief looked at his son, pride and sorrow flickering in his eyes. "You defied me," he said quietly, "and yet perhaps the spirits were with you." The sheriff took a slow step forward, lowering his head slightly in respect. "I can't take back what's been done," he said, "but I can choose what happens now." No one spoke again for a long time. The chief turned to his people. "The land is tired of blood," he said. "Let it rest." Then he looked to the sheriff. "Take your wounded, leave our dead where they fell. Earth will remember all of them." The sheriff nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was enough. The war was over, not with victory, but with exhaustion and truth. That night, the rain stopped completely. The stars returned, scattered across the sky like tiny fires. The settlement was half burned, the Apache camp silent under the mountain. The sheriff's daughter stayed beside the warrior, tending to his wound. Her father came once to the door of the cabin where they rested. He stood there for a long time, the lantern light soft on his face. "You love him," he said at last. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "Then you'll have to live with what comes," he said, his voice quiet but not unkind. "Love like that doesn't belong to one side of a border." He turned and walked away, his shadow long against the dying firelight. Days passed before the warrior could stand again. His people had moved deeper into the hills, away from the reach of the settlers. He knew he couldn't stay in her town, and she knew she couldn't go with him, not yet. The wound of war was too fresh, the memories too close. But before he left, he took her hand and placed something in her palm, a small stone, carved into the shape of an eagle. "When you see it fly," he said softly, "remember that our hearts found each other once, even in the middle of war." She closed her fingers around it and whispered, "And when the wind carries the sound of drums, I'll know it's you." He rode away before dawn, the mist curling around his horse's hooves. She watched until he vanished into the canyon, the pendant still warm in her hand. Behind her, the town slowly began to rebuild. The people spoke less about the war and more about the harvest, the rain, and the quiet peace that seemed strange but welcome. The sheriff grew older, slower, but more thoughtful. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the mountains, he would pause in his work, as if listening for something only he could hear. Seasons changed. The valley that had once smelled of fire and blood turned green again. Grass grew over the graves, and the river, once red with mud, ran clear. Traders began to pass through without fear, and the Apaches were seen again on the far ridge, watching but not attacking. It was as if the land itself had healed faster than the people who lived on it. Years later, she stood by that same river where they had first met, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes still bright. The eagle stone hung around her neck. Sometimes she swore she could hear drums in the wind, faint and distant, like a heartbeat across the hills. Once, when the sky was gold with evening, she saw a lone rider far off on the ridge. He didn't come closer, but he raised his hand in silent greeting before turning back toward the mountains. She smiled through her tears, knowing that some bonds didn't need words or distance. The sheriff's daughter never married. Some said she was waiting for a ghost. Others said her heart already belonged to the land between two worlds. The truth was simpler. She had learned that love, like peace, could not be forced or earned. It had to be chosen every day, even when it hurt. And somewhere beyond the hills, the son of the Apache chief carried the same truth with him, teaching his people that not all enemies were meant to be fought. In time, stories began to spread. The settlers spoke of the woman who stood between two armies and stopped the killing. The Apaches told of a warrior who defied his father for the sake of love and peace. The legends changed with every telling, but the heart of it stayed the same. That once, in a valley of smoke and rain, two souls had dared to stand against hate, and the land had listened. When the wind moved through the canyon at night, it still carried their names, one whispered in English, the other in Apache, woven together like prayer and song. Though the world around them changed, the valley remained quiet and watchful, holding the memory of their courage. The sheriff was buried near the edge of town, his badge rusted with age, but his tombstone marked with the words, "He made peace where none could be made." Not far from there, in a hidden clearing where the river bends, the daughter's grave rested beneath a wild oak tree. The eagle pendant lay in the soil beside her. And somewhere beyond the mountains, among the cliffs where the eagle still flew, a small circle of stones marked the place where the son of the Apache chief was laid to rest, facing east the direction of dawn. The story of the Apache warrior and the sheriff's daughter lived on long after both their worlds were gone. It was told around campfires and songs and in the hush between thunder and silence. Some called it a love story. Others said it was about the end of an old war. But those who truly understood knew it was both a story of two hearts that refused to be taught what to hate, and instead showed the land that even in the harshest places, love could still bloom like wild sage after the rain.